the 2018 Commonwealth Innovation Forum, brought to you by Destination Gold Coast.
And now, ladies and gentlemen, to our plenary session this morning, and this is on healing the people of the Commonwealth. Our speaker here is a Hear and Say board member, a terrific organisation doing wonderful and new things in the innovation space. And to deliver this morning's talk is someone who has experienced firsthand the phenomenal benefits of a modern health system. I'm going to let him tell you the story though. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Matthew Ames.
Thank you, Madonna. I am lucky I can see you. I can speak to you, and I can hear you. Simple things that I used to take for granted. Almost 6 years ago, I lost all of those and more. I was reminded the other day why I shouldn't take those things for granted. You see, my wife and I have 4 beautiful young kids. They're all at school. So a night out without them is a little bit like liquid gold. It was absolutely fantastic. We were lucky enough to realise that the comedy festival was on here in Brisbane, and it was just a few weeks ago. So organised the babysitter, went out that particular night to a small venue here in Brisbane. It was a great night. You know, it was a fairly small, cosy venue. I had to roll in past a number of people, making sure I didn't roll over their toes, squeeze into position, and proceeded to then really enjoy ourselves, laughing out loud with everybody around me. It was an absolutely fantastic evening. Then, about 3/4 of the way into the particular comedy routine, my belly was a little bit sore from laughing. All of a sudden, I heard a beep in my left ear, and I kind of went, uh-oh. And then, just a couple of minutes later, I heard 3 beeps. And then all of a sudden, all of the sound in my left ear cut out altogether. See, I have a cochlear implant in my left ear, and that thing, like many medical devices, need batteries. I didn't realise the batteries were low before I went in. In the middle of a small comedy venue, the last thing you want to do is draw attention to yourself because you're going to get picked on. So I decided, it was a little bit difficult just to wait it out, and I'm sure it would be all okay. The next thing that I know, I started to kind of miss a few words. I can hear in my right ear, but I've got a hearing aid in my right ear. So I started struggling a bit, missing the odd word here and there. And it's amazing in a comedy routine if you miss a couple of words, things that were hilariously funny only a couple of minutes ago. All of a sudden you're kind of going, really didn't get that joke, don't quite understand what that meant. So the next 20 minutes of the routine, I looked around me as everybody was, enjoying and laughing, as I consistently was going, I have no idea what that joke was. I'm sure it was pretty good. And over those 20 minutes, I had to observe everybody else enjoying themselves, and a feeling of exclusion came over me. This little bubble world that you kind of can sit in, looking out at everybody else, not feeling a part of it. Again, a reminder why I no longer take those things for granted. Then once the show ended, we went outside, popped a couple of batteries in my ear, and then everything was fine again. I've been rejoined into the world that we live in. It was a reminder for me of all the fantastic innovations that have brought me to where I am today. There have been many. It's a wonderful time to be alive. If we are going to heal the people of the Commonwealth, we need to embrace the innovations that we've taken to date, but we certainly need to find a lot more. For me, my journey with the healthcare industry started just under 6 years ago. You'll see on the next slide, I started off having a fairly sore throat. That sore throat almost killed me. See, I'd contracted a group A strep infection, an infection that decided that it wasn't just going to stay in my throat, it decided to go invasive into my bloodstream. Following that, I then contracted sepsis from that infection, toxic shock syndrome, and then eventually ended up in a coma. Over the series of a few days, in an effort to try and stem the infection, while I was in my coma, they removed my left arm. Unfortunately, that didn't work, and they proceeded to take the remaining 3 limbs in one surgery. They gave me about a 1% chance to survive, but lucky, I'm pretty stubborn, and I'm still here today. All because of an infection. For me, I thought this was a fairly rare event, not something that you hear about very often. In the circles that I travel in, unfortunately, it's not as rare as I would hope. On the next slide, you'll see a small gathering of a fairly exclusive club, not a club that you really want to be part of. To get into this club, you need no hands and no feet. We call ourselves the Quad Squad, and this is just a few of our members here in Australia. The joys of social media and communication, which we've been talking about, this group is now in excess of about 100 around the world. And the stories that we hear from each other are chillingly similar. It keeps happening again and again and again. And on the next slide, you'll see an image that may be familiar to some of you. I don't expect you to read it, but it's basically the global risk map by the World Economic Forum. On there are a number of different risks that the world faces and that we need to address. And importantly, the top health risk on that particular risk map is that of the spread of infectious diseases. If we are going to heal the people of the Commonwealth, it makes sense to start there. It makes sense to start where we have the most significant risk. So in my view, there are a number of things that we can continue to do. There are lots of opportunities that we have to be able to improve and heal the people of the Commonwealth. And I put them under 2 broad categories. The first thing is simply stop the bugs. How do we stop and treat those infections? And the second thing that we need to do is, if things do get through our barriers, how do we rehabilitate, restore people's function when they've actually lost that function? So turning first to stopping the bugs. How do we do this? Now, generally everybody will jump to what's on the next slide, antibiotics. But I want to spend a minute before we actually get to that particular point, talking about a couple of things that I think are absolutely critical. The first one we tend to take for granted in developed countries, and that's the universal access to healthcare. I was fortunate enough to have that, and I'm sure it's the reason why I'm here today. Many people in the Commonwealth are not so lucky. How do we find innovative ways to make sure that that universal healthcare is available? Then once you actually get access to that healthcare, what is the quality of the healthcare? And how do you actually address and find the problems that you may encounter? And I think for me, the particular thing that I would love a significant amount of innovation to be created is in this space, which is in the diagnostic space. I kept getting told that I had a viral infection. Clearly, with the results that happened, I didn't. I had a bacterial infection. How can we make sure, through innovative ways, that the diagnostics are not only developed, but also available to those people who need them? How do we make sure that we actually know what we're treating? How do we make sure that the right particular course of treatment is picked? I heard the other day that there's a particular new innovation in the US being fast-tracked about taking cultures from bacteria from days down to hours. It's those kinds of innovations that will make a huge difference in this particular space, which I'll go into. I think the other thing for me that's particularly important is around awareness. You're not going to get good diagnosis if you don't have good awareness. And this is, I think, where sharing and communicating within the Commonwealth can do a fantastic job in addressing these particular issues. Infections quite often cause sepsis. In Australia, at least, sepsis kills 2 times as many people as road accidents. Yet how often do we actually hear about it? There are a number of programs that have been used throughout the Commonwealth. The UK is a world leader in this particular area, where we can actually learn from each other and use information from other jurisdictions in the health space. Even within our own countries, where jurisdictions are split up into different healthcare systems. New South Wales led the charge in relation to awareness around sepsis. I'm involved in a project here in Queensland which is trying to catch up. But a lot of states in Australia haven't even started, which I think in this scenario is almost criminal. So how do we create that environment, create the awareness, create the diagnosis? And I think the other thing that is a fantastic opportunity is in the healthcare systems and data space. In this area where we're getting into more and more electronic records and management systems within hospitals, there's opportunities for us to embed those diagnoses. There are some areas overseas where we've actually got scenarios where those electronic healthcare systems are actually flagging diagnoses to the clinicians to say, check for this. There are options that we have before we even get to the antibiotic space. Now, in relation to antibiotics, for me, I think the really key message that I would actually want people to understand is it's about the right antibiotic to the right person at the right time. It's about a balanced view. People are going to need antibiotics, but make sure they actually do need it. And when they do need it, get it to them. Now, the reason why I say a balanced view is that I've got a very balanced view through my own case. I had an infection that was easily stopped by antibiotics. I just didn't get it for a number of different reasons. When I did get them, it was too late. It wasn't the right time. The ones that I did get, unfortunately, were not powerful enough to stop the removal and the damage that happened to me. And in addition to that, the antibiotics also were the things that killed my hearing. There are side effects to powerful antibiotics. So how do we become fantastic stewards of those antibiotics? The panel after the break is much more learned than me on how we can actually do this. But I think it's about making sure that we have that balanced view. There are estimated around 700,000 deaths a year around the world because we have antibiotics that no longer work, the drug-resistant strains of bacteria. We need to preserve the antibiotics that we do have so they are effective when we actually need them. To balance that out, there is also in excess of 10 million people who die from infections. So antibiotics are particularly important. We need to make sure that the stock that we do have is kept and used wisely. The other thing is the lack of research and the lack of involvement in finding new antibiotics has led to a scenario where we haven't had any significant antibiotics discovered, I understand, for a number of decades. There are a number of projects to try and address this, but how do we find innovative ways of identifying those antibiotics, particularly when the commercial returns may not be there compared to other drug research? How do we incentivise? How do we use government resources potentially? Because the stock that we do have is going to run out if we don't do something about it. Moving on to my second point. If you do actually have scenarios where the defences don't work and you need to repair the damage, how do you actually do that? Well, for me, that's been one of the most interesting and perversely exciting parts of my rehabilitation. I've had different things attached, inserted, pulled, prodded over the last 6 years. And the thing that's taught me is the value of research, the value of time, and the value of fantastic, smart, innovative people. I have combined multiple different technologies to achieve my outcomes. The first thing that I tried to do was use prosthetics. Now, I am wearing 4 prosthetics today, but that has taken quite a long time. Initially, I put a number of different things on, but none of them particularly worked. For me, because my residual limbs are so short, there was no way of actually attaching those prosthetics to me in a way that I could use them. So the next slide will show you. The key issue that I actually looked for was structural connection. How do you actually connect bits that people lost back onto them? And I think this is where some fantastic life sciences have come in around different ways of actually doing this. For me, it came in the form of osseointegration, which is effectively large bolts in the end of my bones on all 4. I believe I'm the first in the world to have all 4 limbs with bolts coming out of them. Not a record that I really wanted to hold, but it has really enabled me to do things that I didn't expect to be able to do when I first woke up. Although this hasn't been talked about for a particularly long time, this particular project started in 1992. So I certainly recognise the time and effort that it takes to get these projects up and running. As we solve the problems around structural connection, the question then becomes, what are we actually going to connect to people? Now, the next slide will show you a number of different attachments that I have. I have 5 sets of arms and I have 2 sets of legs, and counting. It's kind of like going to your workshop. You're not going to pick up a hammer to try and cut a piece of wood. You'll pick up a saw. So for me, there are different tools that I need for different things that I need to do. I think the advancements in this area, particularly over the past 10 years, have been immense. You look at the robotics that we have in the world. However, robotics are only particularly useful if you can control them. The US military, through various research projects, have put together a functional arm that mimics every single degree of freedom that we have in an arm. It can be controlled particularly well. Just imagine your hand and your arm, about how many different movements that your brain can actually tell your hand or your arm. There are 21, 23 degrees of freedom in your arm, and there's both ways. So there's off the bat is 46. Then you think of all the other individual movements and ways that you can actually move. So out of those 46 plus different movements, current conventional techniques mean that I can actually use 2 of those 46. And that's where we had come up until only just a couple of years ago. So my challenge to everyone in the life sciences space in this area is not so much the robotics, it's how do we actually connect those robotics to our computer, our brain. It's an area which has not yet been cracked. It's an area of great interest and research, but it's one that would enable a plethora of devices to be managed. Not just limbs, but eyes, ears. We're pretty lucky. The next slide will show you that we've already done this. You know, as I mentioned before, I'm lucky enough to have received a cochlear implant and work with a local group here called Hear and Say, which help young kids to hear again. It's truly amazing. It's amazing what that technology can do. When you think about the cochlear implant, one of the key things that it actually resolved was how do you actually get information through from our body to an electrical device, and how do you get it to communicate between each other, and how do you get that information in and through part of the body to be able to talk to our brains. As wonderful as this is, and as long as it's being developed, the cochlear implant still only controls 22 little electrodes. There is still a long way to go, and we can do a lot more. The theme that I've heard of over yesterday and today is around collaboration. For me, I certainly wouldn't have achieved what I've achieved to date without a significant number of partners. So if you look at the next slide, this is my collaboration map. This is just me, one person. I don't go to one particular person. I go to many people. And it relies on those people talking to each other. And it's not only across states, but across nations, across the globe. My team stretches from one suburb away from here in Brisbane to hospitals, number of hospitals here in Brisbane. I have a team down in Melbourne. I have experts that help me in Chicago, in Texas. I have a team in Vienna and Sweden, all to differing levels. But without that collaboration on something that's been quite challenging, I would still be lying in bed, not being able to do any functional tasks. And through that, and it's because of that reason, which has led me to get involved in a project here in Queensland called Bionics Queensland. And the next slide will give you an indication of some of the fantastic things that are happening around this space. And it's really, for me, around that human-machine bionic interface. How do you simply get those wonderful technology, robotics, bionics, whatever you ever want to call it, how do you get those wonderful machines to be able to connect to our body? It's something that we really haven't addressed, and it's one of the fantastic things that we can do. So when we talk about innovation and putting people back together and repairing the damage, it's collaboration through this space that I think will make the biggest difference. We keep talking about technology. We keep on interacting with our phones. That's fantastic. But until we actually connect things to our body, we won't really take full advantage of that technology in the health space. And on a final note, the next slide is about really one of the key things for me. We talk about life sciences, and I think that's in a particularly fantastic order. We talk about life and we talk about sciences. I think in this space, one of the tricks and one of the things that I observe is that we talk about the second before the first. We talk about the sciences before we talk about the life. It's the life that drives this industry. The science helps us get us there. As somebody who is a voracious consumer of a lot of the different products in this area. I do not care what technology that I use. What I care about is what I can do with it. It's my life. As I said, I have many different prosthetics. I have some whiz-band prosthetics that have a huge amount of technology in them. Articulated fingers, rotating wrists, I have a motorised elbow. Fantastic technology, but as you'll see today, I have 1912 cable-operated technology. Why is that? Because the other ones are broken. Technology breaks. So how do we actually address that? How do we actually not only think, yes, this is fantastic science, but how do we actually help people achieve their goals? How do we help the people, heal the people of the Commonwealth so that they can do life? So that we can all listen, so that we can all speak, and so that we can all see. My hope is that you join me in not taking those for granted. Thank you.
Matthew, thank you. I also know you have a car. Did you drive here today?
Not today because the parking's a bit hard around here. But I haven't worked out if anybody can work out how to stick these out a window and grab a boom gate parking ticket. That's my current program.
Even that little example, though, shows another means of technology that's needed, doesn't it?
Yeah. So it's not a life science, but getting driving again was just a huge, life-changing thing for me, being able to become dad taxi again. Sometimes I scratch my head and wonder why, but it's that technology, but interacting with it, and it's those small things that matter.
Ladies and gentlemen, please thank Matthew Ames.
Thank you.